welcome to Tribe Talks, and thank you so much for taking the time out to come and spend some time to talk about this really important subject. I'd like to start by just introducing the project very briefly, we are working with some fantastic partners, the Royal Holloway, University of London, and the University of Manchester on a really interesting project called Civic Theatres, A Place for Towns. And it's been a fantastic, eye-opening conversation for us as an arts organisation that focuses on race-orientated work. To our knowledge, I think this is the first time that a conversation about the civic space is being had from a race and empire perspective. So hopefully we'll be having some really fruitful conversations. We might be running a little bit over by about 5 or 6 minutes, technical side. I really hope that we have the other little performances and videos lined up for you. We hope that they do work. But yeah, so this is a conversation that I think is quite unique, especially in the arts sector, at least. I just want to tell you a little bit about the Tribe Talks format. It kind of is the origin of our organisation. I should also maybe start off by introducing who I am. I'm Tash Palmer-Thor. I'm the Artistic Director of Tribe Arts. And we have been working on this project for about 2 years now. It was supposed to be a live in-person event, and obviously that COVID has made sure that is not happening. So we are going to try and bring you the magic of what Tribe Talks is over Zoom. Tribe Talks is a format that tries to theatricalize a conversation. So in a live event, it intersperses the conversation with live performance, music and film, and also food as well. Food is a big part of the chat. So you're all at home and you're all comfortable. We do encourage you to maybe have some nibbles while you're engaged in this conversation. And the whole idea of Tribe Talks is that we are trying to engender very real, very honest, very provocative and barrier-breaking conversations to discuss around the civic space. We also want this whole event to be quite flowing and quite porous, the conversation. So even though we do have certain speakers, very esteemed speakers that we have invited to help us and support the conversation, we are very open to questions being directed to us throughout the event whenever they come to you. If you have a question, Sam will explain a bit more about that when we get to the housekeeping side. But we are quite open to questions, and we'll try and filter them in as quick as we can as the conversation goes. And we have a great lineup for you ahead. We've got some fantastic speakers on waiting and ready to support some of the conversations that we're having. Please keep your mics muted. The event's being recorded, so if you don't want if you don't want to be seen on the cameras, please turn them off. But obviously, we would love to see all of you. If you have any questions, to put them through the chat facility or to raise your hand using the raise hand facility as part of Zoom, and that there will be an interval in about an hour's time. Cool, so we're going to go into the first section of the event, which is Civilizing Civilization, and we hopefully have a video ready. So we are going into the first section, which is Civilizing Civilization, Who Defined the Civic? This section is all about really looking at some of the origins of the conception of the civic, looking at some of the early origins of where the idea of the civic came from. We have some fantastic speakers here to help us with that conversation. Shauna Hunter and Corinne Fowler, and we also have Michael Ohajiru, and we will be putting up details of these speakers as they're speaking. So Corinne, let's go straight with you. What do you think, who do you think has defined the civic?
How long do you want me to speak for, just so I don't take up too much time?
This is a conversation you could probably go on for ages, but say the main points and we'll try and bring some other people in.
Well, in response to your really interesting questions, obviously I know quite a lot about country houses and their connections to the British Empire, but you also got me thinking a bit more about built heritage and the way in which our buildings and civic spaces are actually all part of colonial history. So I've been thinking a little bit about some of the brilliant work done by the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project, about philanthropy by people who were involved in the slavery business, building of things like Blue Coat School by the owner of Speke Hall in Liverpool. That reference is for Michael, because I know he's from Liverpool. All kinds of philanthropic projects and philanthropic giving, which is basically about converting the profits of slavery into something which is defined as somehow a civilized space. So it's about converting colonial wealth into philanthropy, country houses, theatres, and the arts, and so on. And I was looking through the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database and looking at how many individuals did commission art or sculpture, were benefactors, were patrons, were trustees or collectors. And there were 491 individuals, and there are 691 instances of where that was the case. So things like George Bailey, who had plantations in St. Vincent, giving to the Thane Royal Academy, and then you've got trusteeships by people like Alexander Baring of the British Museum, the National Gallery, and Francis Baring giving to the University of London, and then other people giving to the Royal Academy of Music, and so on. So theatres are all part of that. But I think when it comes to galleries in particular, you have to think about the amazing reassessments that are going on at the moment, for example, with the National Portrait Gallery of their collections, and whose portraits are there, of course, and why, and whose portraits aren't there. And then when there are portraits of African or Indian sitters in the corner of the painting usually, or placed in a servile position, that those sitters' biographies have never been investigated much by art historians. It's just been completely ignored. So I suppose those were the sorts of things that I was thinking about in response to the question, but I hope to be able to come back to some of those ideas about the hierarchies of race and the ideologies of race, which are connected to not just colonialism, but the way in which we present our colonial history and the colonial history of our civic spaces in particular.
Thanks very much, Corinne. I mean, I think you've made some fantastic points there in terms of some of the origins of that. I think, I'd like to bring in Shauna Hunter now as well. We're talking about some of the early origins of what the idea of civic is, and it's quite closely related, as Corinne says, to empire building and colonization and some of those kinds of aspects. What, in terms of, from your sort of perspective, Shauna, in terms of the sort of power dynamics of that, what do you think is, what do you think has maintained that colonial idea really of the civic, and how it's sort of perceived today, or how it might have changed or maybe not changed since its inception?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks for that, Taj, and thanks for that, Corinne. Actually, just as you were talking, that I was exactly thinking about the, I think I don't know whether you called them conversion. I would call them conversion narratives that we have around coloniality and around how that works and around the violence of coloniality and how it, when it is then imported or re-imported back into the context, the English context that we're talking about now, it gets represented as something benevolent. So I'm quite interested in those dynamics, the dynamics of how violence is represented as a form of benevolence. And those examples that you were talking about, Corinne, strike me as some of the material aspects of that dynamic. So in terms of that question, Taj, and thinking, you explicitly asked us the question in the blurb about how far civic spaces are white spaces. And so for me, part of the power dynamic that we're talking about in our current kind of global colonial context is the power dynamic of whiteness. And I mean, in terms of the broad kind of thematics that you've given us, and thinking about how the civic not only is maintained, but how our civic is actually defined. I don't know whether, can you all hear me? And I don't know whether to
Yeah,
check.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Let me know if I'm speaking into the ether, somebody. um, yeah, so I was thinking about that as Kareem was talking, and I was thinking for me, one of the most important kind of basic things for us to get when we're talking about coloniality. So when I talk about coloniality, I'm talking about the present enactment of colonial histories. So when we're talking about present coloniality in the context of England, where I am in Yorkshire, indeed, um, we're thinking the kind of power dynamic and the definitional, the kind of cultural definitional aspect of that doesn't often get explored is this explicitly anyway in the context of the public domain is whiteness as an orientation to power. So I mean, I suppose that's kind of my broader interest is how whiteness works, not necessarily as how whiteness is an orientation to power, a set of practices, a set of meanings that gets attached to certain bodies, but isn't necessarily about those bodies. So when I'm talking about whiteness, I'm talking about that orientation to power that's defined through kind of colonialism, and then
Mm.
present via coloniality. And I think there's two things I'd say, and I'm aware of time as well. I'm kind of trying to watch. So there's two things I'll say, and then maybe we can kind of come back to them. But when we're thinking about whiteness as an orientation to power, for me, the key way that whiteness presents itself is as the right to own. So the right to own property, the right to own places, the right to own people, and even the right to possess the self. So whiteness as um, a kind of psychic orientation, a cultural orientation, and a set of material practices. So, like buying and selling or the commissioning of art that Corinne's just been talking about, are actually the practices of whiteness at work, but we don't necessarily call it that. But
Yeah.
so the short answer to the how do the power dynamics and that power dynamic of coloniality kind of get framed, get set in place, and then maintained? It's through that set of practices that we call whiteness. So it's about ownership, and then when we own something, we are able to offer that thing as a gift. And so, how this kind of conversion narrative of coloniality works in its broadest sense in all sorts of different sectors is via that conversion narrative. So, looking at me as a white person who's schooled very literally in, racialized as white, I'm schooled in that sort of ownership. So, um, our kind of orientation to the world, even where we imagine we're being kind, helpful, benevolent, offering money, gifts, charity, or even the commissioning of art, in that last example, um, those acts of benevolence, yeah, the right to belong, yeah, exactly. I've just seen Corinne's just put that up. Absolutely. So ownership and the ability to then invite or offer or befriend, or all of those things that being able to own something, or at least imagine one has the right to own it, produce, is kind of the central dynamic of whiteness. But of course, that's a violent dynamic. It's not necessarily a helpful one. So shall I stop? I feel like I've talked a lot.
I know we can go on for ages, and to be honest with you, some of the things that you talk about are so interesting. I just want to hold on to some of the things that you've mentioned about the whole power dynamics. For instance, the ownership idea. I mean, when we're talking about the civic, I think we've established from what Corinne says, from what you says, it's that it's definitely very much rooted, especially the British sense of civicness is very much rooted in empire building and the idea of, I guess, control and ownership. I want to just bring in Michael now into the conversation. If we just sort of stick with that theme, Michael, like the idea of sort of, I guess, brainwashing people, or the idea of using the civic or using civic spaces, using, those sort of early museums and early art galleries and those kind of Victorian institutions that we still have here that are regarded as the crown jewels by the establishment. Those kinds of spaces, if the idea of civic was used to kind of control people in the sense, to try and influence them about superiority and to try and, reassert that superiority in those kind of structures. How do you think art has played a role in also doing that, whether directly, indirectly, or whether, whether artists know it or don't know it?
Okay, it's fundamental to that. It's really at the heart of it. Because if you go back to the earliest galleries, I was thinking about this, what Shona said about whiteness and rightness. I love that, the concept of whiteness is rightness. In terms of these galleries, I'm thinking of the National Gallery. When that was set up, it wasn't a National Gallery, it was Angerstein's gallery, and I was on the Pall Mall, and you could visit that gallery if you had clean boots. Clean boots. This was the elites opening up their space, but the people who were appropriately dressed. And that groove of you can come in, but on our terms. We're opening this world to you. And the artists they were to look to were the Renaissance canon. They're looking at classical Rome, Greece. They defined a space where they as elites could be connoisseurs of these great works of art, and they could allow us to peep in and see how we fitted in. The working man fitted in. And what you're doing now through Tribe, you're breaking that down. Say, look, hang on a sec. It's not all about elites allowing us in. We are in there anyway. We are in there anyway. Because if you look at the art that they were doing, you look at those artists like Constable, Turner, they were doing art for the common man. Yeah, elites collected it and kind of built this wall around it. And that connoisseur elite runs to this day. If you look at, and I'm going to be up front here, if you look at some of the trustees of some of our great institutions, they're often sustaining that myth of elitism. We know best. But at the same time, things are changing. And I just want to pick up one thing that Corinne said about some of the portraits in the National Portrait Gallery, where you've got a noble white sitter, usually with his male, with his library behind him, and he's got a servile attendant. Yeah, we know nothing about the servile black attendant. But what's happening now? And I've got a small shout out to the National Portrait Gallery. They are changing that now. They're actually saying with a black attendant, with a black servant, they're actually acknowledging it's a person there. So the elites, they're opening up a little bit, so things are changing. Okay, you say not fast enough, but I think, they're realizing now that, you've got to let us in if you want to sustain yourself as an institution for the next decade, the next 20, 30, 40 years. You can't,
I was just going to, sorry to interrupt you. So let's just, the point that you've just made right at the end, that they're realizing that they've got to let us in to sustain themselves. I wonder if we can maybe just unpick that point a little bit, and the fact that actually, do they need to let us in because some of the origins of those organizations have been sustained for many hundreds of years on the backs of some of the histories of colonialism. Corinne, I wanted to ask you about this idea, I mean, building on what Michael's mentioned, whether there's actually, you know, whether public art spaces, not just museums and galleries, but generally the wider art sector, do you think that there's that some of these spaces are curated with a narrative in mind that is, you know, that is then either bolstered, curated, influenced, reinforced by these spaces? You obviously have done worked with many of these institutions. What's your sort of take on that?
Well, I mean, I have to say that I agree with Michael about the change that is afoot, because I think there is genuinely a shift happening at the moment. I only have a sense of that because I did the National Trust report. I co-authored it on its country houses connections to empire, and that connected me with the rest of the heritage sector, but also the museum sector. And people come and tell me what they're doing all the time, and it was a real watershed moment. The Black Lives Matter, the discussions and conversations that happened at that time, even though there was a massive backlash to that, and that continues, and then the kind of culture wars ensued soon after and polluted and contaminated that conversation. Even so, my sense is that a transformation was already underway, and that a lot of work was quietly happening in the background, and that indeed people like Michael and a range of historians were already bringing to the public attention some really important stories. So the John Blank, the sort of earliest image on the Henry VIII tournament roll of the first black, you know, the first piece of art, well, not, you know, piece of art which depicts an African in Britain. And so I think that there's so much change was already underfoot, especially since 2007, when there was a lot of temporary exhibition work which then disappeared, that it just enabled organisations to say, well, hang on, we really need to do some reparative history here. We need to examine ourselves, and we need to have major culture change. How far that's possible when you've got a group of privileged people trying to effect change, and when you've got senior partners and always junior partners who are the external collaborators, this is part of the problem.
Well, this is what I was just about to mention. I mean, so we're, you know, talking about, you know, who's actually managing these spaces, who's actually defining these spaces. This is the section that we're in right now, right? I mean, some of the formation of these spaces is undoubtedly is happening with prejudices at the fore, potentially. What's your take on that, and whether and I suppose this question is actually directed more to Shauna. Shauna, from a whiteness perspective, the idea of white dynamic, the power dynamics, can these spaces ever be curated without unconscious bias seeping in? And what do you say to that?
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting, Taj. Look, I want to kind of go back even further a little bit to what Michael just said before, because for me, I think that, you know, if we look at this longue durée history and not just recent history, then, you know, whiteness is not without its various others, right? There's agency everywhere. There's resistant agency. You know, whiteness is a fantasy position, right? So the necessity to keep reproducing power dynamics is about the fact that actually whiteness and the power dynamic that sustains it only exists with that reproduction, right? So for me, what's really important is when there is a total I'm going to use the blanking out as a kind of but a whitening out of of what's actually happening in the broader kind of social context and the artistic and creative context. And I think this comes back to definition. So I think that's really important. I think whose agencies are we talking about, and whose reality is being talked about when we talk about art, and when we're talking about what we imagine to be the civic space from a mainstream perspective, then we imagine it to be white. But I think there are other civic spaces, right? So I think that's really important to say. And I think, no, in terms of the power dynamics, if there are only people who are invested or even disinvesting themselves, you know, in the power dynamics of whiteness that they're situated within, and I don't always use this notion of benefit because it gets us into these who benefits, who doesn't. I think we're all invested in this because we're all situated in it differently. But I think, look, the short answer to the question is no, you can't have just white folks. And I know that's not quite what you're saying, right? It's more complicated than that. So I think no. But I think the way we understand what is happening there is important, because it's not just about white bodies being in the space. So who's the elite and who gets to define what in what ways, and all that is important. And I also think I want to really kick back against the idea that these conversations they're taking a particular form at the moment. But you know, you're here. You're doing this, aren't you? You know, you don't need my permission or any, you know, for want of a better way of putting it. Yeah. So
I think also it's testament to the fact that, you know, these conversations are obviously very, very vital, very, very urgent. You know, the sort of the turnout on the event, but also just generally the kind of, you know, the zeitgeist that we're in right now, where these questions are very much on the fore, and, you know, bringing some of these conversations that we're having into a more modern context. You know, we've obviously had the Black Lives Matter movement, but also the toppling of statues and the redefining of some of these civic spaces. Corinne, what's your take on this sort of, you know, this new wave of people of color, or people who have been affected by colonialism, and really see civic spaces as a thorn or a memento, I guess, of, you know, of empire. What's your thinking around that?
I think one of the problems that we have as a nation is that the history of empire has been repressed, and it's not taught very well in schools. So it comes as a surprise to many people who are hostile to talking about the evidence, you know, having an evidence-based conversation about the history of empire and what the British Empire actually involved, as opposed to the fantasy version that many would like to hold on to as sort of part of their sort of white British identity. And so I think that the reason that statues in particular have become such a focus is, you know, is complicated, but in particular it's because we need to rethink together who we commemorate, who we honour, and which histories we choose to ignore. And so I think that is just part of the journey that we're on. But I think that we have embarked on that journey because the kind of the colonial genie is out of the bottle, and we can't put it back in again. So these conversations are really important in trying to think through constructively how we might best approach that, and who should have a say, and how we can make sure that the gatekeepers recognise and respect experts of colour, understand that the hierarchies which we have are part of the structural inequality in which we are all embedded. Therefore, just because you're more senior doesn't mean that you haven't got there through your privilege, and someone's juniority is no reflection of their expertise or insight or ability to contribute. So I think, and that kind of gatekeeping is a massive issue, a massive hurdle as well, and political interference, of course, and politicising it in a way that is particularly unhelpful and just drives a wedge between people instead of enabling us to have a constructive, evidence-based conversation about it.
And Michael, just finally, before we move on to the next session, because I'm very conscious about time and we are overrunning a little bit due to the technical problems that we had. Building on what Corinne's just mentioned about, sort of gatekeeping. I mean, it's quite obvious in the way that on a global scale, for instance, we talked when we originally had a conversation, we talked about the American dream being this idea of, anyone can kind of make it and everyone's got a chance. Whereas in the UK, it's very much definitely holding on to sort of these archaic gatekeeping hierarchical structures. Do you want to just expand on that a little bit more?
I'd like to pick on what Corinne said in terms of the elites, the power bases in charge, the gatekeepers. And they're there, they'll always be there. But what's exciting now is there's enough of us, we're on this call tonight, I mean, enough young people who've got energy, vision, and are redefining history. And what's exciting, they're using the same tools that they were taught in by these people who were saying you're wrong. They're asking the same Socratic questioning, who, how, when, where, what. They're not taking the old histories, they're re-examining them. And their tutors, their so-called betters are upset by this. But there's, as Corinne said, the genie is out the bottle now. The questions are being asked. And for me, one of my big takeaways from what happened last year with Black Lives Matter was Coulson's statue now. You should just Google what it looks like now. They've actually, it's an exhibit in Bristol Museum, and it's lying on its back. It's got the graffiti on. Okay, it's respectful. It's behind glass, it's a venerated object. But nevertheless, they've added to its history. So yes, it was a statue of a venerated person. But hang on a sec, what's all that graffiti on it? What's that about? So they're making it rich. And what they said, we're conserving it. So this is using their conservation tools. We're conserving history. Come on, let's get real. So no, these are exciting times. And yes, we've got elites and trustees and all that. But as long as we've got we using their tools, using their tools to I was gonna say, they say rewrite history. We say just look from a different lens, have a different point of view. Then I think we're in a really good place, and there's some really exciting things happening. With the things that Korea is doing, it's just great. So no, I'm excited about the possibilities, Taj, honestly. So no, I'm not brought down, but I'm excited about what we're going to do to just using their tools to define the future.
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic way. I think it's a very upbeat way to end that section, I think. I was thinking that it was going to be a lot more somber than that. But thank you so much, guys. And we obviously want you still to be part of the following conversations that we're going to be having. Go on, Michael, you've got your hand up.
I can't stop now. Come on, we've only just got going.
I know. But we will probably be touching on some of these topics. They're all interrelated. And I think it's been a fantastic introduction to some of the ideas and the precepts and the concepts of what civicness is. I'm now going to move on to the next section, because I'm sure all of you don't want to be here more than 2 hours, unless you really want to. We'll see how that goes. But we are going to move on to the next section, and hopefully I'm going to play the videos that you guys missed. So we'll speed up to where we are, and we'll come back into the section, which the next section is civic and class. This is now the section for civic and class. So we're going to be looking at kind of the idea of reclaiming spaces and some of the kind of politics, I guess, that are around the idea of the civic. For this section, we have two very esteemed speakers. We have Hassan Mohammed Ali and Doreen Foster, whose information we will be putting on as we speak. This is around civic and class. And what the provocation that we have is who benefits from the spaces. And I think I want to ask that question really to Hassan first. Hassan, who benefits from civic spaces?
Hi, hello everybody. Hello to everybody online. That was a great first discussion. I really, really enjoyed that. So let me try and pick up from where it left off. I think, and one thing I want to say, I observed is that this conversation it's great we're having this conversation in relation to theatre, because I think this conversation, as the previous speakers already said, is well advanced in this kind of museums and galleries sector, maybe the visual arts sector. But it's interesting to me that the theatre sector, if you like, or community, has kind of successfully dodged this whole question up to now. And I think it's interesting to think of the role of theatres in the civic. The first thing to say, of course, is that let's talk about the cities. The cities have always been contested spaces, and those with power have always tried to shape cities in a way that asserts and signals and perpetuates their power. And in actual fact, if you like, theatres play quite an ambiguous role, I think, in that whole process. I mean, the first thing to say, I think, is that if you talk about, for example, contested spaces in cities in the period in which we've lived through, and the kind of class cleansing of cities and the gentrification of cities, is actually artists who've been the kind of shock troops of gentrification. So I think a lot of actually working class communities who have lived in cities or been pushed out of cities don't necessarily see artists in the way that we see ourselves. We see ourselves as being on the side of right and the just and so on and so forth. But actually, I think in lots of ways we've been co-opted into that process of cleansing our cities of working class life. And I think, like I say, theatres will play a rather ambiguous role up and down the country in that. And it's very interesting that there's not many theatres that I can think of who are really confronting history, actually in the same way as museums and the National Trust and galleries are. So we should ask the question, why are they dodging the question at the moment? Largely.
Yeah. And I guess, keeping to theatres, and I suppose other spaces as well, but let's just keep to theatres because that's what my specialism is. And maybe we can have some interactions with other people who are part of the Zoom. By the way, we've had no questions come in yet, so please feel free to drop some questions or to raise your hands as part of the conversation. So yeah, I mean, I want to talk a little bit about, and I want to also bring in Doreen as well, the aesthetics of theatre, or the aesthetics of being in a civic space. What is expected? The idea of there's certain etiquette that might be expected in certain spaces. We all know that in a theatre space, I mean, especially if you go and see an opera, you absolutely cannot speak. You can absolutely not kind of even be seen to be enjoying the performance, lest you get shushed or you get taken out of the building. Maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh, but you get the gist of what I mean. What's your perception, Doreen, around some of these sort of public art spaces, some of these theatrical sort of spaces, and just civic spaces in general, about the idea of the etiquette and how that's maintained, and why you think it's not something that is able to be changed too quickly?
Hi, thanks for that challenge. I think I would say that that in some spaces people are changing the etiquette. Yes, if you at the opera house or some concert halls, you might find that people don't break with conventions, but I think that more and more, in my experience certainly, I've certainly been to concert halls, for example, where people have applauded, let's say the wrong point in a movement or something. And of course, you have to suffer some like kisses and tucks, but actually, I think that those things are happening more and more. So I do think that that people who choose to go to these spaces that were previously considered to be for the privileged few are finding the confidence to participate in ways that they want to participate. So I think that's my sense, to be honest. And I think that the more that happens, more critical mass of people go, then the more that you'll see that some of these conventions breaking down. And I think there's something about, just reflecting on the earlier discussions, I think that the two are very related, that there is something about, I guess, the notion of a civic space and what a civic space is. And for me, a civic space it's more than the big white building, whether it be, the gallery, the National Gallery, the Opera House, whatever it is, they tend to be big white buildings. For me, civic spaces are spaces where people congregate. Activity might happen that's organised in those spaces. It might be, perfectly curated, but they are spaces where people congregate. And I think that if we can take that more, I guess, liberal approach to civic spaces, then I think it's easier to have a conversation about who it's for, and who, parks, exactly. So, and of course, in all these spaces, there are often either we or systems create barriers and ways of excluding people, whether that's because the lighting is poor or the transportation is difficult or whatever it is. But I do feel that actually that communities of people are finding different ways of occupying civic spaces and reclaiming those spaces, because I guess that's what this section's about too, and not feeling so oppressed by these spaces. And the reality of it is, we have to ask ourselves the question, do people actually want to see what is happening in some of these spaces anyway, these old spaces so we need to ask that question, are they actually providing content that people want to experience? And just also, I want to just go back to something else about the permission piece. And I think, as Michael said, made the point about, we exist in those spaces anyway. But I guess I don't think that we need to be asking permission to enter any of these spaces. And I guess there's something about how we, as certainly in my case, as cultural leaders, people who are running organisations, how we help those who work with us to change that narrative. So what we're not doing is creating another generation of people who think that they need permission, seek to need permission to enter these spaces. They don't. We have responsibility to make them open and more welcome.
Yeah, completely. I hear the point. I also want to, moving, sort of building on the point that you've just mentioned, I want to kind of interrogate this idea of, there's two sort of distinct areas really around the civic, isn't there? So there's the idea of who the art serves, who those public spaces serve, and the idea of how they interact once they're being served. And I think, and there seems to be a curious link between that conversation and the idea of the emergence of high art and popular culture, that there seems to be two very distinct ways of being and consuming those types of art. Hassan, do you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, no, I think you make a good point. In one sense, the way that I see it is that what theatres could do is open up a conversation in a city, for example, with its own population about the nature of that city, how it is formed, how it grew, what happened in those public spaces in the past, and to kind of confront its past in a way that Britain as a country seems, or England, let's say, seems unable to do so. For me, the tearing down of the statue in Bristol liberated the whole of Bristol. I think it wasn't just, that's symbolic, but I think it really, maybe it will spark a conversation where Bristol can at last go forward with some acknowledgement of its slaving past. But if you talk about the post emancipation period in the mid-19th century, let's say to the mid-20th century, you're talking about a reshaping of urban landscapes, again with the notion of spaces being curtailed because spaces are dangerous. It's where the proletariat meets. It's where, you know, Peterloo, St. Peter's Square, where the Peterloo protesters in 1819 meet. You know, spaces in middle of cities are very dangerous places, and it's always the case that those with power try and kind of curtail spaces because they see that these are kind of public forums. And of course, theatres are public forums, and they kind of can play that role. But I think in one sense, and I think this is something the theatre establishment have to come to terms with, is that theatres themselves play that kind of civilizing role that Michael's talking about, in terms of who could go to the theatre, who could go to or go to the Holloway Orchestra, or no, it was the civilized people and the people who could step through that door. It was a civilizing process, and it's a kind of way of binding, if you like, the whole population to the imperial or colonial project. And so there's, I think if theatres want to liberate themselves from that heritage, then I think they have to lead the way in as the speakers in the first half said, which is having honest conversations about the city. And it's not just about London, it's also about Manchester, it's about Liverpool. Just one last thing, Taj, I was in Toxteth recently, and there's other people here who know more about it than me. And I was amazed to find out that in the 1950s and 60s, Toxteth had like 20 or 30 African and black clubs that stretched from Toxteth all the way down Upper Parliament Street into the town centre. And that's where the black population actually originally lived, all the way down Parliament Street, into the town centre. Of course, they were originally by the docks, maybe, and how they were kind of ethnically cleansed out of the town centre and pushed up the hill, literally, into Toxteth. And all those clubs were closed down. You see, the civic space should be an anarchic space. It should be a public space. And the question is for theatres and artists, is whether they want to try and reclaim that space as an anarchic public space, or should it be a very controlled corporate space? And that's one of the big dilemmas that we have today, is which way are we going to go? Going down corporate or down the kind of anarchic space that cities always were?
And which way do you, and I suppose this question is open to both Hassan and Doreen, but which way do you think that they are veering towards? Where is the arts sector veering towards in relation to that particular balancing act that you've just mentioned there, about this whole idea of sort of corporate, or as Dan Hutton describes it, and I don't know whether he's actually on this Zoom, and if he is, it'd be great if he says a hello, who's just recently written a book about the idea of the civic space, but very much around, these corporate civic spaces that you mentioned, being sort of, just sort of posh, spaces of performance with a bar attached to it, or are there real spaces like in the very sort of Joan Littlewood type of thinking around, that the civic spaces should be doing something functional for a certain class or a certain community or a certain people?
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem that we face, is we haven't really essentially grappled with that question. Very quickly, I mean, interestingly, I think it's partly to do with the kind of erosion of local democracy. The fact that maybe local councils used to be big players around the table in terms of the arts. They're not really anymore because of the cuts, and they've kind of been replaced by corporate chairs and board members and things like that. And those corporate people are partly complicit in this kind of reshaping of public space into private space, where in one sense you're a kind of trespasser in your own city. So, we are bound, I mean, even theatres who like to think of themselves as liberal are bound up with this kind of capitalist reshaping of our cities, I think.
And Doreen, I mean, we're getting some quite interesting points by the audience on the chat as well. I'm just kind of scrolling up and having a look. Merdad mentioned a really interesting point about, which actually is something that Dan Hutton also mentioned in his book, around the idea of the space of and the space to. So you have the space of, which is the sort of bricks and mortar buildings that we're talking about when we talk about civic, but also the space to do certain things within them or outside them. The interesting idea of you know, the notion that civic spaces can be more dynamic in their thinking. Another point that we have around the idea of civic being a practice, a sort of an artistic practice, and in terms of I guess some of the financial models, some of the financial models of around how the Arts Council or how civic spaces are funded or conceived. You know, you have the Arts Councils, which is primarily funded by the National Lottery, which is primarily something that a lot of working class people or people who are on a certain type of rung within society might be more favourable to be included in and participate in. Yet some of the output of those art spaces don't always generally you know, pay back, I guess, to the people who are paying for those tickets. A lot of the work might be for middle class or sort of high art orientated spaces, and you might get, you know, an engagement, a public engagement period within a program that kind of puts on something for those guys who arguably have funded most of you know, the institution that is putting that on. What would you say around the sort of funding models around that, and what do you think are the challenges present in sort of balancing some of those things? Open to Doreen or Hassan on that one.
I suppose the thing is that most organisations have to balance the requirement to earn a certain amount of income, however you do that, you know, through sponsors and through ticketed income, etc., with creating inclusive programmes. But I think the big thing in what you're saying, though, is, and the important message for me, is that to remain relevant and to ensure that your organisation can survive beyond the generation of people you're currently facing, all organisations, and I think more and more arts organisations are realising this, that actually you have to speak to and reflect and respond to the place in which you're situated. You can't just speak to a single audience that looks a certain way and appreciates a certain type of work. You cannot be sustainable in that space. And I think that during the lockdown period, a lot of larger organisations suddenly understood and appreciated the importance of place and locality, and being more community focused and orientated. The extent to which they're going to continue to that, I can't speak to, but I can certainly say that from our perspective, and this isn't just a pandemic response, that actually for us to survive into the future, to maintain our relevance into the future, we cannot survive on the diet of you know, people who come with their nice high heels in their cars and then, you know, shoot away. We have to be an arts centre that reflects and responds to the needs, aspirations, ambitions of the people who live both in the big houses and the tiny houses in and around us. So, you know, and it goes back to the piece that in the first session about that response, the responsibility of leadership, actually, I think, to recognise that oh, okay, is that for me to wrap up? There's a responsibility for leadership, isn't there, in that, to ensure that everyone understands that, you know, that we are accountable to our communities, you know, the people who pay the National Lottery, and those who don't pay the National Lottery. I'll stop talking now.
Please don't stop talking, but yeah, but I hear what you're saying. Can I also just request that all the speakers for the event, if they could turn on their cameras and also their mics, I want to just start kind of mixing some of the conversations up, because they're not rigid sections, and I'd like to kind of really bring in a few of the sort of people. Sticking on this whole idea of civic and class, I want to just pick up on this idea of and I think Hassan briefly mentioned it about the idea, and so has Doreen, about the idea of it being connected with theatre spaces and art spaces, being connected with the communities in and around where they are. The idea of ghettoization and the way that art spaces potentially perceive some of these spaces. When we kickstarted Offstage Sign, which is a publication that we started during the lockdown, we were in touch with many theatre spaces around that time, and it became apparent as we were speaking to some of our readers that actually a lot of the theatres that are in and around working class areas, or in and around areas where there's more Black and Asian communities, higher density of those kind of people, that they weren't really being, they were definitely only showing up on programming, and they were only being included in the spaces at certain points in the year, for instance, Black History Month, or when it's Diwali or whatever. And there was this real sense that the community knew that. And it was just, they knew it, and actually there was a little bit of resistance when the theatres approached them to try and do stuff, because they just felt like it was just a tick boxing exercise, and it was like an open secret that the theatre knew exactly what they were doing, and so did the community. And every now and again you might get a partnership, but it'll usually be the same partnership that'll happen, that will be happening. So I'd like anyone from any of the speakers that have already spoken to kind of just maybe mention something around that relationship with art spaces and communities, and also just to kind of look at the idea of whether class is a characteristic that is heightened within the art sector, and that in certain areas, in terms of the rhetoric around this type of community engagement work, the rise of what we call disadvantaged people now, and so really what we're talking about is, have some of the words been replaced, have some of the terminologies been replaced? Are the people that the arts sector is appealing to, are they still the same communities, or are we saying that actually class is not really something that we can serve too much because of the way that British society is evolving? And is it now all about sort of disadvantaged people? And we obviously have loads of categories around that, and this idea of equitable civic environments.
I think Evie might want to touch on that. She mentioned something in the chat around art centres, looked at big corporate conference centres, and they never have art on the wall. Would you like to maybe expand on that, Evie? So it's put you in the spotlight.
I know, she's got to come in.
I was just thinking about, as Taj was talking, I was just thinking about, basically, I think so many art centres are intimidating as soon as you enter them, because they are just like big blank walls, big concrete walls. And like, we've been touring with Pieceophobia, and we were next to Home, which is the big art centre in Manchester, and the actors basically, and this is really interesting, I think this is a whole other interesting kind of debate to have, but the actors are Muslim. They wouldn't eat or drink from a place that sells alcohol. As soon as you go in Home, you see a bar, and so they're like, oh shit, like, can't be here, let's go, you know what I mean? And so that's every art centre in the country, to my knowledge, sells alcohol. So straight away you've basically said, okay, the profit sales of selling the alcohol is more important than people who are, for religious reasons, don't go to spaces where there's drink. So that's a massive population. So there's that sort of thing, which is the decision making of like, how do we make money in our art centres? How do we, operate these as, for the people? So straight away, I think there's that sort of thing that comes into it. And honestly, like, I've never, ever been to an art centre. I'd love someone to tell me one where people put art on the walls. Like, it's crazy. Like, honestly, so many art centres, they'll have like one picture very stylishly put up, and straight away it doesn't look or feel like an art centre. I said to the guys, oh, this is an art centre, and they were like, is it? Like, it felt like a bar, because there was no art on the walls. And I think that's what's really interesting, is how messy not messy, like, I still think you can have a beautiful space, like working class people deserve beautiful spaces, but how kind of layered are we prepared to be? How much humanity and are we prepared to bring into our spaces? Because they're always very kind of washed, like these corporate, they look like no other public space that you go to. They don't look like, if you think of public spaces like the library, maybe like, I don't know if a job centre counts as but you know, these places are layered, they've got history, they've got things going on within them. You go into an art centre, it looks like it's just been popped up that day.
Yeah, and sterilised. Thanks so much for that point, Evie. We're gonna hear more from Evie in just a little bit. Hassan, just very quickly, I just before we go into our break, I want to just a couple of minutes, and a couple of minutes from Hassan, and maybe a couple of minutes from Doreen, just quickly around this idea of do you think, and this is a provocation, do you think that the idea of, you know, class, just like race and other sort of, you know, disadvantages, do you think that, especially by the arts sector, do you think it's sometimes glamorized or pushed or enhanced so that the program sounds a little bit more sexy and it sounds a little bit more appealing to funders or, you know, the audiences? Do you think there's an element of that?
Well, let's start from the basics. I went into theatre in about 1984. Right, statistically speaking, if I was me today, I would never had a chance to go into theatre, because theatre has become more rarefied than even in the 1980s, and that was under Margaret Thatcher. And class dominates, and I think intersects with all the things that we're talking about. You know, most Black communities are working class communities, after all. Do you know what I mean? So we are talking about the same people. But I think the arts have become more and more rarefied, not just middle class, which they always were, but kind of very upper middle class, with exceptions. And I think the output reflects that. I don't think theatre, for example, or the arts in general, will be able to really grapple with the question of social class until we have what we had in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the emergence of working class artists kind of pushing their way onto the scene and rewriting the kind of rules of theatre or visual arts or whatever it might be. That's kind of what we need. But the problem we have, I think, is that there's very little seeding of that working class talent in general, where it's that you kind of had actually in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s even. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of that door's kind of closing off. So I think if we want to articulate conversations about class, we have to let working class people, whatever background, colour, ethnicity, whatever it might be, I think we have to find a way of giving those people an autonomous voice like we used to have, an autonomous voice. That's the only way, I think, in which we'll be able to have a pretty serious conversation about the thing that dogs this country more than anything else, which is the question of class.
Doreen Foster, any last words on that on that section there?
Like I said, I would like to say that I think that art centres are probably therefore more democratic spaces than theatres, because I do think that there are, I think there are spaces for working class voices if people define themselves in that way within art centres, just because I suppose of the range of work that we do and the ways in which we relate to and work with people. So I think that so maybe the art centre is the place for the place that hasn't yet forgotten working class voices. But so I don't feel as pessimistic. I think I do believe that the cultural sector does still have a very strong upper middle class, sort of whatever it is, whatever you want to call it, sort of elite, who I think are actually starting to reflect on their positions and recognizing that, you know, as I think so Winfrey said, like a new day has dawned, and you know, some people are starting to think about, okay, well, what does that mean for me? So I'm slightly more optimistic, I think, than maybe others on the call.
Thank you so much. There were so many more other things that I wanted to really talk about in this section around sort of, I don't know, cancel culture and what's sort of acceptable in those spaces and things like that. But and the idea of struggle and really delve a little bit more into the high art and popular culture sort of split. But unfortunately, time is always a threat. So just so that we don't overrun anymore, I think rather than having a 5-minute break, it'd be great if we could just maybe have a 2-minute break. So I hope that's all right with everybody. So we're going to just go into a 2-minute break, and we will see everybody at 6:40. What are we on? 46, 48. So we'll be back at 6:48, guys. Thank you very much. I hope everyone's relieved themselves, and we're going to continue with the next section, which is the illusion of civic spaces. And in this section, we have Maddie Costa and Joe Williams joining us. And I'm going to be, you'll be able to see more information about the speakers as soon as that happens. As soon as I decide to actually share my screen, and you'll be able to see everything. So I think we should probably potentially maybe start with Joe Williams. Joe, who controls the civic space, would you say?
The one with the dominant narrative, perhaps?
Very short and sweet answer. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
I think civic spaces need to be deluged with the diversity that represents society, and I think that's how we work our way toward equity, is that if your narrative isn't included in the civic space, then claw as you might, it becomes very easy to exclude you again. We need civic spaces that go to the great lengths that they need to be more inclusive of the narratives of the people in their communities that they represent.
And just tell us a little bit, because you run a really interesting program up here in Leeds called Heritage Corner. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that? Because that strikes me as very much sort of taking ownership of creating your own sort of, civic space.
Well, yes, thanks. It's not waiting for the machinery to do it, because you find that that's very, 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 very slow and archaic, and is full of fear at the moment of being overrun. I think that's a lot of the challenges is you're getting backlash and reaction. And Hassan asked earlier, why are theatres dodging the issue? Theatre is my background. And so I found that my narratives were excluded from theatre. And in trying to be more inclusive, you got the backlash that you had to deal with. And it was like, what? I'm a human being, what's going on? And so therefore, rather than wait, I think it's good, and that you see it all over the place, people taking their own initiative and claiming the space, whether it's given to you or not. And particularly with the history that I deal with in terms of African heritage and how it relates to Britain, is that there are so many connections of how Africa contributed to not just the notion of civic spaces, but the financial bracketives that gave people the extra income to think about such things. And so therefore the exclusion of people who've contributed is a continuation in the African context of the issue of degradation, of misrepresentation, and of appropriation without giving any credit. And society seems to be in a position of deer in headlights of, oh gosh, they're exposing us, what do we do? And I think the fact that so many people have joined this Zoom, which is so encouraging, I don't think there is any one particular solution. I think everybody's got to work to their strengths. All of the speakers, they all have their own individual approach. We don't have a collective approach to this, but what we do have is a collective problem, in that we identify that there's a blockage to where people can express their humanity. How do we unblock that? And I think it's great that people are taking individual approaches. It's very complex, but I think if we can start with writing people's narratives into their communities, into their civic areas, so that people get to learn about each other, I think that's basic, but it's not happening because it seems to be threatening the hegemony
Well, I was just going to mention, I mean, obviously, Heritage Corner, you've taken the decision to be able to start writing the narratives within your local space in which you live and work. What do you do when there's a resistance or a backlash to that? And obviously, what I'm really hinting at there is, this idea of cancel culture and sort of this culture wars of which heritage and which sort of story gets preserved. There is an equal, the idea of. I'm going to let you talk because I think you know exactly what I'm asking.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Yeah. You kind of, well, I don't know if there's any particularly one way to deal with cancel culture, and you learn from people like Corinne and people like David Olusoga, who deal with the cancel culture brigade excellently, and that always gives me an uplift, because they'll always be there. A framework has been created by slavery and colonialism that is targeted to benefit some people and exclude others. So those that have been benefited are definitely going to feel threatened if that framework is being chipped away at. But I think for Heritage Corner, what we decided to focus on was how does exterior narratives to Britain's heritage connect with Britain's heritage. And I didn't think there'd be much information, but surprisingly, there is a lot. So through the work that I've done, I myself feel more like a citizen of Britain, because I've learned more about what Africans have actually contributed to Britain over the past, not just the past 400 and 500 years, but as Peter Fryer's Staying Power and David Olusoga's Black and British, and Akala's Natives, and Afua Hirsch, British, and all these books have already confirmed, and the work that Corinne's doing and other people, is that Africa and other places have made contribution to Britain's identity. They chose to use the finances from slavery and colonialism to say we did it all ourselves. And that's not the case. So I'm just stepping outside of that framework, which becomes a trap, really, because anything you put into that framework becomes that framework. So you have no choice but to stand outside it and say, we can connect to that framework, but in a more inclusive way.
Thank you. I also want to just quickly remind our audience as well that you're free to ask questions, and I still haven't had any hands up, which is quite unusual for a Tribe Talks, I must say. Maddie, let's bring you in. Building on from what Joe has mentioned, and from this idea of kind of who gets to control that narrative, there seems to be a sort of a bit of a war in terms of who those spaces, where those sort of designated spaces are for this wider frame of history. Recently, during the pandemic, it was announced that there was the Lowry and the Birmingham Rep had become Nightingale courts, which meant that actually partnerships with Tallowa Theatre, one of the most prominent Black theatres in this country, ended their partnership with them because of its association with a community that they obviously represent more than anything else. And it would be interesting to hear what you think about this idea, just using that sort of example and kind of trying to really understand who controls that space. For me, it was a bit of an expression that actually the audience do. The theatre was serving the Black community there essentially, and that they said, look, no, we don't want to have this partnership. This is detrimental to the principles that we stand for. But then at the same time, the kind of thing that Joe mentioned, you do have institutions and other kinds of dominant hegemonic spaces that kind of want to maintain a certain narrative, regardless of the backlash that they might get. What's your take on that?
Oh my God, such a big question.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's fine. But also this has just been amazing. And so I just feel like my brain is a bit exploding and feel a bit overexcited. So I'm just really not going to make anything like coherent sense. But the thing about the Birmingham Rep and the Lowry was it was like
I feel like what's been happening over pandemic is a bunch of stuff that was maybe under the surface or invisible or kind of known but not known, just kind of like came up like scum to the surface. It was one of those moments of kind of seeing how theatre sits inside of a power structure, and a kind of lack of care, like an extraordinary lack of care. And something that I've been saying about theatre for years and years is that for an art form like so fundamentally predicated on human relationship, like theatre's really bad at human relationships. It's really bad at like making sure people have decent working conditions. It's really bad at kind of allowing humanity to exist inside of the theatre space, you know. Like I've been I'm working at the moment with a designer called Rosie O'Neill, who is thinking a lot about how the set design work that she does is basically like there to frame labor. And how a lot of the time, because a lot of the time she works with Black artists, the labor that she's framing is the sort of replication of experiences of trauma. And so she's in this sort of extraordinary process of questioning what it means to be a designer, and like, is that what she wants to build inside of theatres? So there's loads and loads in this, and I sort of want to park that and want to jump on a thing that Joe said, actually, because it also made me go a bit like around like the one with the dominant narrative controlling the space. I wanted to tell a story of someone I'm working with at the moment, basically because I had a meeting with her directly before coming to here, like as if this weren't enough Zoom already. It's a young Pakistani woman who lives in Peterborough, and she's part of a project that I'm doing, writing about theatre, specifically writing about some participatory work that's happening in 4 different places around the country. Commonwealth are one of the companies involved in it as well. And so Ikra wrote her first piece of writing about this show, and I read it and I was like, okay, this is beautifully written, but it also doesn't sound like her. It sounds like something that I would read in The Guardian. And so I had a conversation with her, and I said, so Ikra, can I ask, who did you have in mind as your audience when you wrote this? And literally she was like, white people. And I've come across this before, like working with young writers who of African, Caribbean, Pakistani, Indian, Asian heritage, kind of like they will write like really beautifully, but to fit the kind of like dominant structures of what is understood to be good writing. And so the conversation that I have with them is that if you're doing that writing, like occupying an objective voice, and you're not thinking about what who occupies the objective voice, and the fact that the objective voice is also a voice of whiteness, then like we're not hearing you, and you're not allowing any change to happen by entering this conversation. So it kind of, Joe saying that about the dominant narrative, it's not just, that's not about a person, that's about it's also what Shona was talking about right at the beginning of kind of whiteness being so dominant that it actually becomes internalized in people. And so like that, again, like what I was saying about kind of sort of scum, the scum of power rising to the surface and becoming visible when the Lowry and Birmingham Rep kind of joined forces with I can't even remember the name of, you know, like with courts, with justice. Like these things need to become visible. They need to be made visible for people to even know that they're replicating them.
Joe, what about, I mean, building on from what Maddie said and from what you previously said, I mean, and we've also talked about this in the first section, the idea of the white gaze and the etiquette that surrounds these kind of spaces. Arguably, you know, you've obviously had to deal with that yourself as an ex-theatre director yourself. And I guess a lot of generic audience members who maybe not be regular theatre goers and maybe who are regular theatre goers absolutely understand that there is an etiquette and a behaviour expectation when you're in a theatre space, indeed any kind of public space, even a park, essentially. So what is your thinking around how the white gaze and that etiquette system is maintained, and whether there is any merit in that being broken down?
Good question. I think the power base behind this etiquette and behind exclusion, I might be wrong, but from my experience, it's subscribers. I think theatre directors are terrified of subscribers writing letters. They have the power. And so the theatre directors and staff may have one approach, but if the subscribers don't like it, they can be in serious trouble. And how do you get to subscribers? Theatres have to navigate that. I think we have seen since George Floyd, it takes something terrible to happen that then creates a kind of selective subconscious, oh, yes, change is inevitable. And then before long, it can go back again. That's the danger, because that framework is very strong. And you can work with individuals in theatres. You can make headway around anti-racism, but that person leaves, or, you know, then it goes back again, back to the same framework. So that's a difficult one. I genuinely think it's a meeting on the crossroads somewhere, whereby people aren't waiting for that magic door to open, that they're empowering themselves, telling their own stories in whatever way possible. And so to actually make theatres come to you and want to work with you and build partnerships with others, you know, until the theatre can actually come on board, because it's not just the artistic director or the creative or administrative team. It's an entity unto itself. And MPs have their say as well. If a theatre gets too controversial, which the subscribers keep them informed of. So I don't know if there's a particular answer. I just think we need to keep a creative approach to tackling that framework.
I mean, I completely hear you, and I guess from the answer that you've just expanded on, and from what Maddie's said as well, I mean, there's obviously an awareness that does exist, and I think even, you know, when we have creative answers to try and address that, Maddie, do you think that it's still I mean, I guess what I'm really trying to ask is there any way, and is there a want for that etiquette to be broken down? Because I feel like there might be some kind of connection between the white gaze and the etiquette and the expectation of these spaces that maintains the control of who controls those spaces. Is there, or would you say there is a link between those two things, Maddie?
Well, where I see it starting to break down is in relaxed performances. So I'm very gingerly starting to go back into seeing live theatre, and I went to the Bush Theatre in London last week, and that that was designated a relaxed performance at the beginning. So around you can, you know, be vocal and demonstrative in your response, and it's just like, it just feels incredibly comfortable. Like, you know, like my mum's well, like she's literally sung along with stuff at the national. So I kind of and like, as far as I'm concerned, kind of 98% performance should be in relaxed settings. And then Jess Tom, who works as Tourette's Hero, has got this brilliant line that final 2% can be like the uptight shows, and the uptight is kind of the sort of standard etiquette. And my thinking around that has been really sharpened by an academic called Kirsty Sedgman, who's written a book about audiences, and written about the ways in which that etiquette was literally designed during the Victorian era to control, as a form of social control. The concept of relaxed performances is really just good at breaking that down.
I mean, I would say a lot of Black and Asian people, well, I've been to all the shows that I've been to, and we would say that the relaxed performance is the standard for Black and Asian shows, for real. And I think that is one of the things. I mean, would you not agree, Joe? I mean, that is one of the principal reasons why, you know, regular arts attenders, we work in the industry, so, you know, we're a little bit more bold to go into those, interact with them. But, you know, the average man who has never been to see any show, do you think that there would be some sense of, you know, the overwhelming sense of not being invited, of not being welcome in those spaces because of this overbearance of the etiquette and the fact that there is no relaxation and there's no chill time in these spaces?
Yeah, I like both, because I benefited from the etiquette as a child. I was involved in the arts in a real civic spirit, in the post-war II era of teachers who wanted to give young people something different, a different experience. I literally was a member of the civic theatre as a child and took part in the youth players as part of the civic theatre. And I really felt like I was a part of the city. And in those days, a lot of the old Victorian buildings hadn't been pulled down yet, and they were derelict. That's where we made our set, in the city centre, and you got to know a little bit about the history and you felt a part of it. So it was heartbreaking to become an adult and then to be excluded from that. And I don't think that's just the etiquette, I think that's fear. I enjoyed seeing playwrights, J.B. Priestley and different playwrights at the old Leeds Playhouse. We saw every show at the old Leeds Playhouse. So we were kind of trained into the etiquette. We were taken to the Grand Theatre to see opera and ballet and contemporary dance. And I benefited from that. And I think young people, if trained, should be allowed to benefit from that. But because of the fear and the backlash, I think everything's being dumbed down, because it's like, oh, where's this going if we empower people who are different from us? Well, they become citizens. And that's what we want.
I was just going to mention this. I mean, very, very briefly, because I'm very conscious of time, and I think we are going to be probably overrunning by about 5 minutes, which I hope that's not too much of an ask. You know, the idea of multiculturalism, you know, I mean, it's a word that you don't really hear much about, but it was definitely a buzzword in the 90s. I mean, as a Sikh man myself, like whenever my family's gone to the theatre, for instance, you know, it's very obvious that you should not be speaking your own language. You know, you should be speaking English, or you don't speak at all, which I think is probably more prevalent it's obviously very prevalent with people of colour. But there was this very intriguing article that I came across very recently, that the Arts Council of Wales and the National Museum of Wales was called out for being racist institutions because they enforced the Welsh language to be spoken, and they were called out for being racist because of the fact that they were not using English, which I found to be a really, really interesting dichotomy, actually, because you have on the one hand this really interesting, you have on the one hand the dominance of England and Englishness and the establishment and all that kind of stuff. But then, you know, we are a nation we're kingdom nations. We have various different other cultures and backgrounds as part of the United Kingdom. Why should Wales not be able to enforce Welsh, or or Scotland not be able to enforce Gaelic, or whatever else the situation might be? I found that situation to be really, I mean, it runs parallel to whether people from India should be speaking Punjabi, Hindi, Urdu, and all those kind of things. It was a very similar situation. I don't know who wants to answer that, and I'm gonna open that up to any of the speakers that have currently spoken and who haven't spoken yet. We have still got two couple more speakers. Michael's really enthusiastic. Go on, Michael.
For me, this is a classic case of that Venn diagram, in terms of the Venn diagram where we overlap. This is Britishness. This is Punjabi. This is Black Liverpool. This is other. As we come together, and it's that interaction, how we accept. Now, one of the things, each has to sacrifice to come into that space. And now maybe we accept it. Let me give you a radical example. I wear a mask now. I wear a mask when I go into a shop, when I go on the train, because it's a respect for other people. But a lot of people don't. And I would argue it's some way of finding that common ground. You can sit on your high hill and say, this is me, I'm not wearing a mask, I'm going to speak Punjabi, I'm going to be Black, whatever. It doesn't bring us together. And I think what brings us together, that's the magic of Britishness. And it's an elusive thing. But it's that coming together that says, yeah, this is okay. This is, we're getting something together out of this. Because the subtext is, you want to be together. You want to be together. Because if you don't, then remain Black, keep speaking Punjabi, Welsh, or whatever. We're never going to get there together. So for me, it's about understanding that I'm going to use the C word here, compromise. As you compromise.
I'm going to come to Maddie in just a little. This might bridge what you want to say, Maddie. But the compromise. Do you not feel that maybe people of color might feel like the compromise is more heavy on their side than any other community?
Hang on a sec. The most successful people in any negotiation are those who have the most options. If your option is, if your only option is, I want to speak Punjabi, I want to be Black, I want to be Welsh, then there's a problem here. You've got a binary negotiation. You've got to look for options to negotiate, to bring us together. And for me, that's pure British. You look for these options, ways around, and you try and make it. It's not perfect, but you try and make it work. If you want to be exclusive, then okay, be over there and be your own thing. But if we want to come together and create something, that's, you've got to compromise.
Maddie, compromise. What's your
I just wanted to, so I've been doing a lot of research recently into community arts, and specifically like the history of Hoxton Hall in the 70s, and it was run by 7 people. Like the idea of 7 people running a theatre now is so wild, but it was exactly in that spirit. It was exactly in that spirit of like, we cooperate, and all of the work that we make, well, most of the work that we make is with the community, and so we are, by example, showing other people how they can also cooperate. And it was exactly that. It's exactly what you've just described, Michael. And it was happening. It was totally happening in community arts, and all of that stuff was literally suppressed and broken down and pushed aside, and the history has not been sufficiently written. I think I saw Alison Jeffers mentioned in the chat earlier and got really excited because she's written, she's co-authored a collective fantastic book on this that I've recently read. But like all of that practice, it's not like it's disappeared, but there's a way in which the wheel keeps having to be reinvented because it keeps being suppressed.
Yeah, I feel the same way about theatre and education. But again, to pick up on the point that Michael made, and that was just reiterated, compromise is very important. We're Heritage Corner delivering a Black History Walk of Harewood House. And, you know, for decades we're saying, why don't you include the history? Yeah, but how do we do it? Compromise, share the narrative. So we deliver a Black History Walk that includes the Druids, it includes the Normans, and we talk about the current incumbent's father and the engagement and marriage of his father and the funeral of his grandmother, because this is important to the Lascelles household. But then we also talk about Timbuktu and the Nile Valley civilizations and their contributions to Britain, as well as transatlantic trade. So you compromise and you share the narrative. And we haven't had much funding to achieve that. It's ridiculous that for decades we've been saying, can you be more inclusive? How do we do it? And and they've got the budget and we don't, but we can. And I think that ties in with what you were just saying. We seem to take the brunt of it.
Yeah, and these are, you know, words that that are obviously become absolutely vogue, but sometimes they don't have a fruition in terms of reality. Shona, I think you had your hand up. I think someone else has got their hand up. I can't find the screen, but someone's had their hand up. But if that's you, then yeah, just butt in. But Shona, go on, your final point.
Well, I mean, it might be opening a bit of a can of worms a bit later on, but I think this issue of compromise, like I get the practices that we're all talking about, but I think I would still want to say something different than the notion of compromise, because I think the practices that Joe and that Michael and that Maddie were just talking about, I don't think that's compromise. I think that's thinking about I don't even want to use the notion of inclusion, because they're so debased actually in the public narrative when they're co-opted by formalized institutional narrative. So I just think the thing that white folks do, who are embodying whiteness in a particular way, is they use those, you know, so this is the conundrum we're in. I mean, I think the stuff around really resisting the definitions that we're all in, and these are definitions about you are this or you are that. I mean, anyway, so I'm going on a bit long. I think I can see the person, I can't see their name. I think it's Medad, is that right? Who's got the hand up? I think.
Medad, yeah. Can I also just say as well, Medad, before you ask the question, we're going to be talking about exactly that in the next section, Shona, which I think is probably the most controversial bit of the whole thing, and it's just starting to become like a Tribe Talks now, because we've got some cross-party conversations. Yeah, 2 hours in, and everyone's turned their cameras off, like, you know, and we've got like the brave 10 or 12 people that I can see who've got their cameras on. So, you know, I'd encourage you all to put your cameras on and then partake. But go on, Medad, you were going to just make a quick point before we go to the next section.
Yeah, no, I think some interesting point made by Maddie and Joe. But what I was going to raise is the issue of the alternative narrative, or the kind of the create or writing something for the white audience. And the danger that in that is an assumption that we can actually have clear identities a little bit here, you know, in the sense that, oh, well, I'm going to write something, or I'm going to create something, which represents this particular background that I come from, or so and so comes from, and maybe that's not necessarily the way that it is. You know, that actually our existence as individuals, as subjects, is far more complex than that. You know, I almost typed, as you were talking, Maddie, Baba's expression of mimic man. Do you know what I mean? Which I really like, that concept of, you know, the colonials creating, if you like, the anglicized, you know, the English colonials, especially anglicized, but in kind of mimicking the English. But in doing that, they also create their own downfall, because the gaze of the disciplinary gaze imposed upon them turns around. And I think that is a more interesting thing. The danger for me with these clear narratives that go side by side, you know, is that actually, I mean, going back to what Joe was saying, you know, and your complaint, Joe, about the fact that you don't get funding, but they do. And that's where the danger is, that they remain parallel and the people in power remain in power. So there must be a way of, you know, another way which goes beyond simply, you know, creating these clear narratives, so to speak.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mehrdad. I'm going to go into the next section, but we are going to be continuing this exact conversation when we come back. So the next section is civic appropriation, a British tool of multiculturalism, and we're actually on the Relegate portion of our conversation.
Of course you can, in the same way that you can have vegetarian chicken. It's fake, it's not real, it's a perfectly acceptable replacement, I suppose, but it isn't the real thing. So
Mean it.
Do the work, be inclusive, make it a reality.
The idea of the civic can harness bad press because of its association with colonialism and the fact that that in itself can seem to be stifling what we want to see in arts and culture moving forward from here. What I think is important is that we are ready and prepared to have difficult conversations, and that we need to hold the space in order for those difficult conversations to be able to be explored so that we can reach an outcome which makes it better for the arts and culture sector.
Hearts and minds need to be open. The art sector needs to create partnerships with cultural hubs like ours. We're already doing the work, so yeah, you need to just come and experience it yourselves. Perhaps 2025, ready?
Of course, because we're full of passion. I've got nothing to hide and everything to show, because I'm full of talent. Our elders went through hell first. They rebelled and yelled so they could tell the stories. You can't tell me to shut up. Listen to my story in my mother tongue, not in dubs or subtitles. We dress in our glory. We will address all of our stories. We were back of the classrooms to now teaching them, so we shall be back in those spaces. We are the source, and we are the resource. We are everything that our ancestors were, and we are going to claim the space.
We're in civic appropriation, and I'm so sorry that we're late on this, because this is when the event should be closing down. But I thank the next set of speakers who are still persevering with us, and indeed everybody else who's still here. So we are going to be speaking about just exactly what we were speaking about. We have in this section Cully Tiarai, Evie Manning, and Helen Bastran, who we are going to hear from. I would just like to maybe start with Cully Tiarai, with the first provocation, which I'm just moving to now. What detriments the civic space, Cully? We've heard a lot of conversation now around the origins of it, how it's maintained, how it's sustained, how those structures are, carry on and perpetuated. And Sean has just mentioned about this idea of the dominant hegemony and the dominant narrative. Would you say that having a dominant narrative or having a dominant narrative would detriment a civic space? Does it need to be more along the lines of what Michael AHRC is saying about coming together?
Well, I always think about civic spaces not as bricks and mortar, but as places of convening and coming together. So I think in that sense, the word civic, I think, is sometimes useful and sometimes not so useful, because actually every cultural organization has a civic responsibility. That's not about, that's about representing the people of its place, and it might not be the same thing in Leeds as it might be in Bradford or as it might be in Tooting, because if you're true to being embedded in your communities and convening the stories and the narratives of your citizens. And actually that in itself is a powerful conversation to be hosting. So I think where you define that as a controlling principle is where the challenge is, when you think that actually there's a homogenization that needs to happen in order to protect the powerful or those who are in positions of authority and can navigate that story. So I suppose for me, it's it's interesting, that question about compromise, because I completely understand, and we have, for years had to navigate quite complex circumstances to be in some of those spaces. But I also think that more powerfully than compromise is the ability to subvert and to disrupt. And sometimes it's in agitation to the mainstream where you can be most powerful. Now, that's not an easy place to always be at. And what the sort of mainstream, certainly in the sort of cultural sector, tends to do is that it scoops up everything, and it's like a giant hoover, whereas there might have been variety and diversity in the ways in which people are telling their stories, whether that's in youth clubs or in community spaces or in schools or through TIE or through the women's movement or whatever. All of that's kind of got harnessed into a sort of an attempt to box it in, and some of that's been by taking away key funding, and some of it's about those big institutions saying through other mechanisms being told to either deliver those things or wanting to deliver those things. So I think that's very detrimental to any civic space for us, for one thing to be stand for everything, and in a way pluralism is really important. That's why we need that rich ecology to be really nurtured and fought for, and that's where I think compromise isn't enough, really. I think we have to constantly be demanding and also playing to our own tunes in order that people understand there's a complexity in how we all are. And there's a number of people in this room where we could tick many boxes in terms of criteria of how we're labelled and boxed in, not one singular one. And I think the idea of a civic space also trying to just be a singular dominant narrative is problematic as a consequence of that.
Yeah, and I think this whole idea of compromise that Michael has introduced into the conversation, which we keep going on about, and I think it's a very interesting idea, because I think that the ultimate question that arises from that is who does the compromising, and is it inevitable that the non-dominant culture is always going to be on the receiving end of that? Arguably, there have been quite a few successful models of the civic. I mean, Slonglow, we just heard from Alan Lane, very successful, always creating spaces from absolutely nothing. Evie, do you think that even successful models like Slonglow have any barriers for maybe particularly people of colour, but any other types of people in the light of this pluralism that we're talking about?
Well, I don't know. I suppose straight away you could say, well, it is a bar. It's a working men's club. It's got its own historical roots, which might be excluding to some people, But then I think it's difficult to be all things to all people. I mean, oh God, I don't know. I think even with Commonwealth, so we're saying, okay, that's our name. We're trying to bring people, we're finding out what we've got in common. But then even within that, it's actually, personally, a lot of our work is always about going into the very specific, going into really, really, really specific, steel workers in Port Talbot, or Muslim car modifiers, very, very specific. But you go into that specific set of circumstance and you find something that's actually very universal and connects to lots of people. And you'll have people from all different backgrounds come and say, oh, I really feel like that steel worker, or I really felt like that guy who modifies his car. And I think actually I don't think you can necessarily be all things to all people all of the time. I think there's something really powerful about being specific, because in being really specific, because even within that, so we've worked with, sorry, I'm just come out of a play, so I'm just still in that, but there was 3 actors who are not actors, 3 people who are new to acting. They all modify their cars, they're all Muslim. All 3 of them are completely different in every possible way. And so the specificity of like them being themselves on stage means other people watch that and go, oh yeah, right, me being myself, I'm allowed to be that. There's something very kind of humanizing about it, like what Joe said earlier about if we're putting the humanizing into our frameworks of being there and being yourself and being held in that, which actually is the opposite of kind of just stereotyping or saying, okay, we're going to do this Muslim event for Muslim people, when actually there's so much diversity within any community. You can't say this is the Muslim event or this is the Black event, because that doesn't, there's so much diversity within each group of people. So I think there's something about theatre when it's really powerful, that it is just allowing people to be human, to be themselves, to be seen, and then that in itself. Sorry, I've gone totally off the question around like what's the success.
I'm gonna rein you back in. I mean, you mentioned some really interesting, like you being all things to all people. We've also always hear those buzzwords: equality, diversity, and inclusion. Do you think they describe everything and nothing at the same time? I'm gonna just go back to Shauna on this one, and then I'd like to come to Cully. About specifically these kind of terminologies that tried to create a multicultural, diverse, inclusive environment, and this idea of specificity that Evie has mentioned, that actually being more specific is where you get the audiences. But if you do become more specific, does it then become a Black show for Black people or a Muslim show for Muslim people? And is there some kind of problem in that? So Shauna.
Yeah, thanks for that, Taj. Well, I think for me, it depends on how you think about specificity, right? So I really loved, I kind of wanted to hear more actually about the example that Evie was giving, really, partly because one of the things that I always say is, if you start from the practices of what's happening in a space, then you end up somewhere totally different than if you use the narratives. It's kind of I feel like we're kind of going back to where Joe and everybody else, specificity is only understood as like difference, uniqueness, problematicness from the perspective of dominance. So I just think, I don't really know whether I'm getting tired. I haven't quite answered the question, but that's what I think. So I think we need to totally rethink how we even think about narratives as well. But this really is maybe too different a place to move to at 20 to 8, but for another day, because the narratives they're narratives, and they can be used for power rather than they're just not real. But that doesn't mean they don't have real effects. So,
well, I guess I'm reminded of the fact that I'm a theatre maker first and foremost, and the impulse to tell a story comes from a position of feeling that there is something to say about the world one is inhabiting. The problem with the sort of the circumstances in which we're operating is that there isn't a multiplicity of people being able to tell stories from the places where, through the lens in which they see the world. So in that context, I suppose, because actually one could argue that, there is a theory that there are only 7 stories in the world anyway, so actually specificity is really, really important in any storytelling approach, in any connection, meaningful connection we make with each other, and the power of live performance and theatre making is a coming together and being able to stand in someone else's shoes for a moment. Is kind of, I always describe it as a bit like a kind of dress rehearsal for life, watching someone else's journey, and you find your own connections through that, if it's a powerful and well told story. The challenge about language is all the stuff that's already been talked about, you know, and sometimes you need to understand how language is being used in order to have some power, in order to be able to be in the spaces and places where to have some voices, to have a voice. In other circumstances, you can fight against it and create a language separate to that or antagonistic to that. I think that's about context, and context is really important in all that we do, and the main means by which we try and navigate complexity. I think the biggest weakness in certainly the arts sector for me is that we're not very good at dealing with complexity. We are, you know, we try and label things in order to control things, and of course you can't always label complexity in the way that it needs to be, because Taj, you and I might both be Punjabi, but our experiences, our gender, our intersectionality, about potentially about class and where we've grown up, and you know, all of that sort of stuff will make our experiences uniquely ours. So I might have more in common with Evie than I might have with you. And actually the industry or our sector doesn't really fully embrace difference and complexity well. It doesn't in its work some of the time, never mind in its policy and structural systems. So I think that's the battleground we really have to fight in a way, because systemic structures work against all of those things.
And I want to come to Pelin in just a moment, but before I do, you've made a really interesting point, Cully, that I want to bridge to. We've got the Chief Creative Officer of Janoon Cafe, that's based in Bradford, that you saw in the film. You're saying, you know, that creating those, the fighting some of those barriers is the chief thing that we need to do. Arguably, Imtiaz, you've been doing that where you're based. You mentioned in your video that you're already doing the work, and actually the sector needs to create partnerships with organisations like yours. Do you want to tell us a bit more?
I don't
know. Yeah, we can hear you now. You might speak a bit louder, but
can you hear me now? Hang on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to congratulate Evie Manning on the piece of phobia show that she did. I was there on the opening, and just thought I'd plug that in. Yeah, it was really good. In terms of the work and stuff, I mean, we've already got the audience, the demographic, in regards of, you know, Black and Asian theatre goers or potential theatre goers. I mean, we've already got them in through the door. We're already doing some of the work. So I think, yeah, partnerships need to be considered with organisations like mine. Yeah, I mean,
do you think the art sector even know about like organisations? Like, I mean, Shisha cafes are very, very intrinsically seen as very intrinsically Asian, Arab, sort of, you know, community bases. Go on, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of education that needs to go on in terms of, we need to educate the other classes and stuff. What was the question again, mate? Kind of put me on the spot.
The question is whether the art sector is actually even knows about you. I mean, have you ever?
Not really. It's just because we're doing our thing for our people, if you know what I mean. We do need to cross the bridge of making partnerships and stuff with people like yourselves. I mean, we're in touch with you and your organisation. We are planning some stuff with yourselves. I mean, we already do things in house like spoken word and live music events, book clubs and stuff like that. We're planning on doing like street events and stuff. So yeah, nobody really knows about us. I mean, we're reaching out, hence why I run this, and yeah.
So Pelin, I want to bring Pelin Basran into the conversation. Do you think that the civic space or the curation of a civic space is a British tool of multiculturalism? Do you think that it helps shape this idea of multiculturalism, this amorphous idea that seems to describe everything and nothing, but also has space for specificity? What do you say to that?
Okay, so it is like I won't be able to answer as it is because there are so many topics that I took notes while people were talking, and also we have a premiere in Battersea. I need to go. I mean, language was quite interesting for me because I was working at Contact Theatre before in Manchester, and so the Contact Theatre has this kind of governance model where the young people are included in the governance in every stage, has been implemented for 20 years, but what their practice, how it is called, has been changed during those 20 years. So it has been inclusivity, it was youth theatre, it was participation, co-creation, and actually what they are doing is the same, but the practice changes. So the language is quite, how it is named is changes. So the language is quite interesting to look at it. And I totally respond is, I kind of find it quite difficult to talk about best practice in art while working the art organizations, because I find in the UK, these organizations are very heavy and really colonial structures. And within this structure, it is really difficult for me to create alternative narrative around that. What I do in my work, just basically doing the work. I mean, a strength, and it is a kind of developing a kind of muscle that in your thinking, in your gaze, and and do this work in every phase. And I'm quite inspired by Sarah Ahmed, her work around doing diversity, and so equality, diversity documents, how they become more than a just document, but how you can make it a work around that. And understanding this complex identities, complex and specificity is really important. And in these documents also, while I'm doing this work, I'm really looking at the specific things to understand this complexity. And relevancy is the main thing for me, for art organizations, basically. And also, I want to just put a one note to around that, because I'm coming from working class in Turkey, but I never called myself working class because the class structure is not as here. But I had I could go to free university and a very good university free. And so that my understanding of knowledge is very different than here, because I don't think that knowledge belongs to elite. So I kind of declare ownership of that, and I have that because of through education, possibly. Of course, there is a whole population who can't go to education. That's another discussion. But that is one of the things that I would like to look at that also while we are talking about diversity, how this through the education, how these things seen basically belong to some specific class, and which is of course also through specific or whiteness, belong to whiteness. So yeah, here what I'm trying to say in art organization, so basically I'm looking specificity is the main word for me, and care and integrity and relevancy, basically.
Yeah, and just very finally, because I know we're really running out. We're really running out of time. Well, I know that I'm really asking too much for you guys to still be here at 8 o'clock in the evening. But I just want to ask one final question, and I wanted to ask it to Cully, but I think she's had to leave. So this is automatically going to go to. Cully's gone now.
Yeah.
So this is automatically going to go to Evie or anybody else who wants to say anything on this matter. But do you think that the civic space generally, in the curation of it, in the upholding of it, in the perpetuation of it, do you think that there is room for exploitation, and do you think it also the civic space tries to assimilate? Do you think that some of the idea of those kind of civic spaces, do you think that they try to assimilate British culture, but also exploit maybe certain communities within British culture?
Yeah, I think like Hassan was saying before about the kind of civilizing, I think that's where civic spaces do try and kind of civilize us, and that's still going on. But then of course there's that level of exploitation of okay, we're going to put the black person on the program cover, but they're not going to be in any of the power structures. You know, that exploitation is happening all the time. I think the programming, often what can be seen as like, oh, we're going to make a bold move here and we're going to take a risk here, but then actually it'll only ever be given, say, 10 grand. It'll be given a fraction of what the big show will be given, or the, you know, the big Christmas show or whatever. And so I think there's always those levels of exploitation around like where the resources are going. And then also I think around like, just obviously we've said a lot about language and stuff, but I think the language we're talking in now, like I'm an artist, I'm a theatre maker, but the language that we all get kind of co-opted and assimilate to is a funding language, because we want the money. So we all start talking and thinking in these certain ways to try and get the money, but then that occupies a space in your brain too. And that is the kind of dominant framework, like in terms of what Joe was talking about, because it's just whatever words are the buzzwords of that government, of that council, of that funder at the moment. And so we all find ourselves assimilating to access the money. So we buy into it ourselves because, you know, we want that stuff. But I'm worried now. I mean, I think this is it goes a bit bigger, but I think now with the level, the Tory government that we've got now is like the worst that I've ever known. I can't believe it's got this bad where they can do whatever they want unchecked. They're literally completely unaccountable at this point. Like a news scandal story comes out, nobody blinks. Like literally every day we're reading about these scandals, and we're not surprised. We just don't care. We're like beyond it. And so I feel like where we're at now, and the fact is that Arts Council money is DCMS. I know there's a divorce there, but I'm worried about what happens when they start to say in funding agreements, you can't talk about this or you can't talk about that, because at the end of the day, well, I know Commonwealth will not go for that stuff. We just won't. And I've said, like, when our Arts Council officer tries to get us to meet with like whoever is the head of culture at that time, I won't go meet them. I don't believe personally in kind of subscribing to the kind of subvert from within thing. I just won't do it. I just can't do it for myself. Like I could never stand in a room and shake a hand with somebody who I know thinks that way and believes that way. So I think there's going to be a really interesting time in the next 5 to 10 years where we're really confronted with what it's meant for us to have assimilated to a degree to the language and to the structures. And then how do we still operate? What does it mean to have care and have all those things that we want and work with people and have justice in how we work, when actually I think we're going to be under a lot of pressure to work in different ways, to think in different ways. And it's like, how much of our brains do we want to, I love Pelin, is like disappearing into the dark. That's really theatrical. Yeah, I just think, yeah, like how much of ourselves are we going to be able to really compromise in terms of our values and our beliefs and our politics? Like, very interesting where we're going.
Michael O'Hadru is screaming at his television screen and we can't hear him, so let's hear him.
You know, I take on board what you say. I take on board, but if we're going to progress, then okay, I've used the word compromise, but you don't compromise your integrity, your own self-belief, your own identity. You cannot compromise that. But at the same time, you can use, and I'm going to use Obama's word, and I use this a lot in my presentations. It's messy. History is messy. Working with other people, that it's not perfect. You've got to find something in that soup, that goo, that you can make it work. And that's the challenge. That's the challenge. I'll go a little bit further. Bear with me. I think that's part of Britishness now, making this messiness work, making it work. Because if we don't, then nothing happens. We all sit in our silos and we're all very happy. So I'm not talking about compromising integrity. But I'm talking, looking that messy pool, how we can get that Venn diagram, how we can come together, out of many we are one. Okay, that sounds a bit pompous.
I don't want to come together with the Tories. I just don't want to.
No, hang on a sec. You say the Tories. I'm sorry. If we're going to progress and be part of this civic space, then there's things we need to do to get in the door. You've got to decide what it takes for you to get in the door. If you want to, you can sit outside and rail forever, no question. But if you want to be inside with them making decisions, then you've got to work with them. I'll finish on this point, bear with me. The progress we've made in many arts, in many sections of the arts today, is because they've used the same narrative, the same techniques that they were taught in O-level, A-level, GCSE, and how to understand, interpret, and present the arts. So you're inserting, using their language to overcome them. That's where I'm coming from. No point in being elite outside. Get inside. Make a difference.
I guess is what you're saying.
I think Shona's got a hand.
Shona has, but and Simi says occupy. You've got to occupy the space, and I totally get what you're saying, and I think I do like that phrase. You know, that maybe being British is to sort out the messiness of Britishness, and it'll be difficult on the sense. Was it Shona? Did you say?
Yeah,
that?
Shona.
Go on, Shona. But it'll probably have to be the last point, just because I really don't want to keep people here until after 8 o'clock.
Well, it's probably opening up something different, but I think it's important to make. I put it in the chat when Michael was talking. I think the thing for me, it's less about the Tories. I'm not a fan of the Tories, probably quite obviously to most of you. But for me, it is about nationalism, right? I mean, the notion of Britishness, I find excruciatingly even my Englishness now, I think, because I would rather gather under a different set of signs. I think we can be more imaginative with our signs. I really do, because if I think of, you know, how colonialism in our current context, because there's other colonialisms, right? We're like 500 years into a particular set of Europe, well, hopefully dying, you know, but I don't want to replace that with another load of colonialisms. I don't know. So I don't know. And a nation for me is I think it's a tarnished sign, because it creates groups and groupings that I think don't allow that fluidity, actually, that somebody was mentioning earlier. I can't remember the guy who had his hand up. Mered, was it? Anyway, I'll shut up now.
Yeah. Well, Tribe Talks rules really forbids me to give an opinion, but I think I'm going to have to say it anyway. But I think you're right. I think the idea of multiculturalism, which was arguably one of the earliest sort of buzzwords that we started hearing in the early 90s about Britishness, is a constructed identity, just like American is a constructed identity. And actually, arguably, many people of color on the globe have been living in societies that have been absolutely multicultural, but you'll never hear the ownership of multicultural seems to be of the West, and it's an ideal that seems to be promulgated by the West, and nobody else does it as good as the Britons do, apparently. Anyway, that's me going on a different tangent now. I've completely broken Tribe Talks rules there. But thank you so much, guys, for attending this. I mean, I would ask questions, and I guess if anyone has any questions that they would like to just fire out, because, you know, we've still got 44 people, and I could imagine that we'd have 44 people still on a Zoom at 8 o'clock in the evening. So if anyone has any questions, I would open it up to the floor. If not, does anyone have any questions, actually, maybe before I say anything? I'm just looking to see if anyone's putting their hand up. No, I don't think anyone does. I think all the speakers have done well. Thank you so much, guys, for turning up. Huge apologies for the technical difficulties that we had right at the beginning. The flow kind of got disrupted somewhat, but you got to see all of the stuff in the end. Thank you so much for persevering with us till 8 o'clock. We hope to have another Tribe Talks at some point. Maybe it'll be a live performance, and please do come down. Follow us on social media. I'd like to also thank all of our speakers, every single one of them for each section. We've had Shona Hunter, Corinne Fowler, Michael Ahajiru, Hassan Mahmoud Ali, Doreen Foster, Maddie Costa, Joe Williams, Kuli Tiarai, Evie Manning, and Pelin Basaran. And I wish you well. I hope you all stay safe, still in these weird pandemic times. And yeah. Thank you very much for attending, guys.
Thank you, guys.